Hey,
Calling Chris Anderson. Oh,
yes.
hang on.
Uh,
It says this stream was deleted on Facebook. I don't know.
no,
I people there?
people are joining us. Lots of Facebook people.
I
I
I'm
mean, lots
s-
of YouTube people, not any Facebook people.
I'm hang on. I'm just trying to see. I don't know if you guys are here, but somehow I think we're not on the History Happy Hour Facebook page, which is upsetting. Um, and I don't know what to do about that. It seems to have just popped up as a technical issue, but we're on the YouTube page. I'm gonna Chris. I'm going to.
What are you
So
going to
is,
do, Rick?
is there is there anybody joining us on
There's lots of
Facebook?
people. Yeah. No,
Well,
no,
Chris,
nobody on Facebook. We have lots of
Chris,
YouTube.
you do the beginning
Oh,
of the
oh, I
show,
see.
and
Okay.
I'm going to put a post on our Facebook page saying to come see us on
All right.
YouTube.
Yeah, and I want to make sure everybody lets Rick know because he's always very technical with me about my lighting and the sound and all this stuff. And it started because he forgot the bell, and now, oh, Rick.
You have to start the show, Chris. You have to.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you mind?
Oh, can I start it then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Start.
okay.
People are there, but it's
All
just not
right.
all the people. So, oh, well, you have to play. You're gonna have to play it yourself.
What do you mean play it myself? I don't. Oh, he's killing me here. No,
Oh, you're hopeless. You're
I am.
hopeless. Okay,
I am.
so fine. So I'll start the show, and we'll hopefully people will figure out where we
Where we are?
we are. Give me a cue.
The bar's open.
I skipped the whole beginning of the show, but go ahead. Introduce Joe. Bring him
All
on, and I'm gonna leave an email message.
Okay. Well, obviously we've been teasing this for a while, and we're obviously thrilled to have Joe Balkoski back on History Happy Hour. As if you don't know who Joe is, you probably haven't had any interest in World War II, because anybody who knows anything about World War II knows that Joe is sort of the dean of historians for Americans during World War II, particularly the 29th Division in Europe. And we have been following Joe's series of books about the 29th Division. And tonight we're going to have the final installment of a history of the 29th Division. This one is the last roll call, the 29th Infantry Division, victorious 1945, where we'll bring all this to an end. So we're very excited to have Joe back with us.
Hey, Joe.
Hi, everyone.
We have to say that this show has okay. So first of all, we did have immense problems getting Joe online with us, and then we've had problems on our Facebook page, and yet somehow we still have 54 people here watching. And I just put up a note on our Facebook page redirecting those people someplace else. And we just want to say, we've all the things we didn't mention at the beginning. This, by the way, is the beginning of our 6th season.
I know.
6th season. This is show number 231.
What an auspicious start.
Do you think we'll get, do you think we'll get to 500? Will we get to 1,000?
Never see.
I know.
I
So
think I was show two, maybe. Was I show
I think you
two?
were pretty early.
you were very early.
You kind of you've been like a benchmark through this whole thing, Joe. I mean,
And I
You're
have
an,
my
you're an
See?
early.
hat. So,
You're,
and it
you're
looks well worn too. So we appreciate it.
yeah.
it's at least been worn once. You're an early.
No, no, it's a great hat. I really enjoy it.
Oh,
So,
excellent, excellent. We're going to
yeah.
use that we're going to take that clip and use that as an advertisement for History Happy Hour for sure. And did you bring a cocktail, Joe? I mean, we've had such a confusion. I don't even know. What did you got? The 29th Division.
29 Let's Go mug, which is filled with an undefined liquid. I'll leave it at that.
All right.
Chris, you want to define your liquid? And your bookshelf either is about to tip over or your camera's a little tilted.
All right. All right.
Whoa, it's going to tip over in the other direction. What have you got to drink?
Glen Turk 12.
All right.
How about you?
I'm drinking a beer. All right.
Mm.
Chris, you can get us started off.
All right. So, Joe, at the beginning of the book, you have a scene where there's a German prisoner brought into Ninth Army for interrogation, and I guess he's coming across as a little arrogant, and he says that I'm thoroughly convinced that Germany's going to win the war. And his interrogators say, "What are you talking about? You must be crazy. How can you think that? Why? I mean, is it the wonder weapons?" And he says, "Perhaps that's going to come one day, but what I need is an infantryman I have. Nicht alle Soldaten sind mutlos. Not all soldiers are despondent." And that quote kind of struck with me as I was reading the book because there's a lot more fighting going on, right? I think, our perception is the Ardennes happens, it's all over, and then we have a victory parade. But as this book kind of clearly points out, there's still a lot of fighting to happen.
It's one of the least understood periods of the European theater. April of 1945 had an enormous amount of casualties on all sides, and more than Normandy. That statement that, I purposefully threw that in the opening couple of paragraphs because, over and over again in the book, you see the lesson that the Führer directive, we are not to give up an inch of the fatherland, was taken so seriously by the Germans. And, and nobody in the 29th Division really had any expectation that the rest of the war was going to be easy. They had a resolution that we were going to win, but nobody thought the Germans were going to give until, Hitler was dead and we were marching into Berlin. And that was the general belief.
Yeah.
So, Joe, this book starts really gets underway at the end of January 1945. The 29th Division is on the Roer River in Germany, across from the town of Jülich. But what is the state? And we've gone through 4 volumes here. What is the state of the 29th Division at this point, 10 months into the fighting in Europe?
Well, we've come a long way, my friends. I mean, the last 4 times I was on your show and talked about the 29th Division, it was really an endless tale of brutal fighting, tremendous casualties, near cracks in morale. But nevertheless, any mission that the 29th Division was given by the High Command was ultimately achieved. But and again, this is a microcosm of the entire U.S. Army in the European theater. That cost was extremely high to achieve those goals, and people, again, one of the focuses of my 5 series of books on the division is how much the soldiers at the so-called tip of the spear suffered. A typical rifle platoon of 43 men. That rifle platoon in the division would land on D-Day, and in a matter of weeks, they were gone, all 43 of them. And, whereas men in some of the rear echelon outfits or some of the units that weren't on the front line, artillery, signal, medical, they suffered losses at a much lesser rate. But the infantry ended up taking 95% of the casualties the division suffered, and by the time January 45 rolls around, it's over 20,000 men who've fallen in battle, and of those 20,000, over 3,000 killed.
And
a division of 14,000.
Yeah, I was going to say we should point out that's of a division of 14,000, so over 100% casualty. Yeah.
But something about to your point, Rick. Confidence never waned. The men, as much as they were enduring tribulations that were hard for us to conceive in the modern age, they were fully ready to renew the battle once the High Command dictated that it would begin again. And I would say that by mid-January of 1945, the 29th Division had not only, succeeded in everything it had done, but it had matured by this point into really a very, very fine fighting outfit. And I don't mean to single out the 29th Division as the only one on the Western Front that was this good, because every U.S. Army unit that had been in battle against the Germans for a couple of months had now matured. What they were expected to do in February on the Roer River, as you pointed out, was one of the most difficult military operations any unit could ever attempt. An assault crossing across a flooded river at a huge velocity of water, and not bridged. They were going to have to bridge it right in the face of the enemy, and then punch into the Rhineland and head to the Rhine. And that is where the book really begins.
So, but Joe, I mean, when we left them from the last book, I remember they were in some pretty dire straits. They were exhausted. They were pretty spent. You touched in the last roll call about how they're kind of reconstituted and that they're in really good shape as they launch this offensive, and we'll get into that. But what are some of the things that they did to kind of sustain that effectiveness? I mean, these aren't the same guys that mobilized in 1941 in Virginia and Maryland, and you get replacements, you're getting all sorts of people. How are they kind of brought on board?
Well, that's a great question. The division was a real innovator in terms of bringing replacements into the front. In Normandy, all Allied divisions had learned the hard way that if you throw replacements into a unit without letting them acclimate to the front, they're going to not do well because they're not ready to go into the front. The 29th Division learned that lesson the hard way because they learned it right from the very beginning on D-Day. And by the time they moved into Brittany, General Gerhardt, and God knows we have many things we've said over the past couple of shows about General Gerhardt, but in a very positive way, he mandated as a division policy that any replacement that comes into the division must have several days, 3 to 5 days behind the front with the unit that he's going to go into battle with, and so he can befriend, if that such a thing was still possible, people in the unit, and get acclimated to throwing a couple of hand grenades, to learn how to dig a foxhole, and in general to try to get a foxhole buddy so that somebody can look out for you and you can look out for him. Yeah. And as I said, it bears repeating, by January 45, having blessedly not been committed to the Battle of the Bulge, they had a period of 2 months sitting on the Roer River in brutal weather, living outside for the most part, but nevertheless having some ability to have the men, rotated in and out of the front and really get to know some of their comrades. And one of the lessons, we'll talk about this later in the show, but there was a classic photograph taken during the Roer River crossing operation on February 23rd, and the man who was in that photograph was a rookie in the 29th Division. And interestingly enough, nobody ended up knowing his name when he was. There's the photo. This photo, Rick and Chris, is one of the most iconic photos of World War II from the American perspective. It appeared in Life magazine on March 12th, 1945, just a couple of weeks after the incident that it depicts happened. And, it was, even at this late date in the war, it was extremely unusual in the American media to show a deceased American soldier in a magazine or a newspaper. And this photo was somewhat shocking. For 65 years, we didn't know who this soldier was. And in a real kind of Sherlock Holmes detective effort, we put together the unit that was crossing this footbridge, the location where it was happening. And, at that time, there were still some veterans who were alive who remembered it. And to cut to the chase, we identified that soldier as a man named Henry Slade Harrell, interestingly from Sunflower, Alabama, a tiny little village north of Mobile. He had only entered the 29th in late November of 44, so he had had a couple of months to acclimate. But the interesting part of this story is that so many of the men who were fortunate enough to have survived the recent cataclysms had come to an attitude that I can't befriend anybody anymore because every time I do that, I lose him. And so some of the veterans, all they remembered about this man whose body they walked over on this slender footbridge over the Roer was that he had red hair and that he was from either Mississippi or Alabama. And that was the smidgen of a clue that, with a lot of laborious research and morning reports, unit after action reports, that we figured out that it was Henry Slade Harrell. And interestingly enough, he'd only been in the Army for 1 year. He had actually been deferred from military service because of asthma. And he wanted to go in, and somehow he convinced the draft board and his father, who didn't want him to go, that he should go. And he went in exactly 1 year to the day before he died. And the poignant part of this story is that nobody ever identified the body in the picture, including the very famous photographer who took the photo, George Silk. I called his daughter, and his daughter is a photographer in Connecticut, and she said that was obviously one of the most tragic moments of her father's World War II photographic career. She said he always regretted never getting his name. So the irony of the story is that Private Harrell, who you see in that photo, his parents subscribed to Life magazine. And in the attic of their home, as recently as, when I made contact with the family 5 or 10 years ago, this issue of Life magazine was in their home. And the parents had no idea that photo that they must have produced in the magazine when they received it in the mail was their son. So that, what a story. That's a story for a Hollywood movie.
Well, and if I'm not mistaken, Joe, isn't it that photograph that's used at the start of the divisional history?
Yeah.
Which is also, I think, kind of, I don't know, he comes to represent all the guys in the 29th.
Very poignant. But the historian who wrote the original division history in 1947, his name was Joe Ewing, one of my best friends, of course, no longer living. He and I, we shared so many things because we were both historians and we both wrote about the 29th. He said that photo embodied the spirit of the 29th Division. And if you open the very first page of the history book, which is one of the finest division histories ever written about a World War II division, it says, "To the men who fell in the battle." And the irony is that Joe Ewing didn't know the name of the soldier when he wrote the book. And now we know. And the family has been so supportive, and we're so honored when they found out that, we learned of his identity. And really, in some sense, I hope that they have some solace of knowing now that, he was, the effort that he died in, and that the unit that he served in was so proud of his service. So, yeah.
And Joe, you say we, but I bet you personally were very involved in identifying him.
Yes, I did the bulk of the work, but it couldn't have been done without a couple of lucky breaks. Sure. Believe it or not, a man who walked over Henry Harrell's body, avoiding machine gun fire as he was doing it, member of Company C of the 175th Infantry. His name is Steve Melnikoff, and he, believe it or not, lives 2 miles away from my home, and he's 105 years old.
Wow.
And without Steve Melnikoff, we wouldn't have been able to do it, because he's the one who remembered that he had red hair.
Mm.
And I remember I didn't tell the people, the family, when I called them up. I was still a little tentative about the identification, but the issue was completely crystallized when I asked, just casually, I said, "Oh, what color hair did Henry have?" And they said red. And then I knew we had it.
So we have some footage of the crossing of the Rhine on February 23rd.
Roer, yeah,
Roar, sorry.
yeah.
Well, at least I didn't mute myself.
There you go. That'll happen in a minute.
We have some footage on the crossing of the Roar on February 23rd. And also in this footage, and it starts out with this, is a conference that you write about in the book of officers of the 29th on February 24th. And it begins with that person that we have talked about in multiple episodes, General Gerhardt. So let me play that.
SBX Germany, Major General Gerhardt, 29th Division Commander.
Gentlemen, the division bridgehead is now secure across the Roer River. Julich is fully in our hands. We have our vehicular bridges are in, and the traffic is rolling in good style, so we can say that we're well set. We've been sitting here a long time waiting to take this place, and we've got it. Now, due to the success of the operation as a whole, the Corps has decided to change the plan. Instead of us proceeding due east and finishing out the Corps bridgehead, we're going to turn. The Corps turns north and attacks two divisions abreast. We will move due north, two regiments abreast, and want to get an early start in the morning, have it set up for full artillery support, make sure that our airstrikes are available, and that we get good, quick progress.
So how is this gonna play out after the crossing of the river at Julich?
Well, that's it bears repeating, Rick, that this division and all U.S. Army divisions that had been at the front a substantial period of time had matured at a level now where they were really, along with their British and Canadian allies, the best troops in the world. The crossing of the Roer was successful, 23rd of February, and then the operation that ensued for really less than a week across the so-called Cologne Plain, very good for vehicular movement, flat, not many elevations, working in tandem with the British 21st Army Group up to the north, which was undertaking Operation Veritable at the same time. They made a giant pincer movement and met west of the Rhine, essentially achieving what Eisenhower had and Bradley and Montgomery had sought, and that was a complete destruction of the German army west of the Rhine. And the big mistake that the Germans had made is that they didn't pull east of the Rhine and allow their army to defend behind that formidable barrier. Instead, due to Hitler's typically, recommendations to his generals, they weren't recommendations, they were orders, that they fight for every foot of the fatherland. It ended up that by the time the Germans were able to withdraw meager forces behind the Rhine, there were not enough left to defend the barrier of the Rhine. And then when we jumped it, the war was, the end of the war was in sight. So in summary, the post Roer crossing campaign is one of the most successful U.S. Army operations of World War II. It absolutely crushed the Germans that were defending the Rhineland at a level even greater than the Falaise Pocket. And, it set the stage for the final stage of the war.
So, Joe, a lot of that, what I find interesting about that is a lot of that comes down to kind of the working relationship between Simpson and Montgomery, and it's not usually the narrative you hear when we talk about World War II in Europe. So, how much of the plan as it's developed is down to Simpson? And since he's obviously the 29th serves in the Ninth Army for so long, tell us a little bit more about him and what part he plays in this really important victory.
Simpson was the brains behind the entire operation. He was I'd have to say the least known, yet perhaps the most skilled U.S. Army commander in the ETO.
Yeah.
He was the opposite of Patton. He did not seek glory. He did not seek media attention, but he was just ruthlessly efficient. And it was no accident that I think Americans don't really understand this, but for much of its combat career, the U.S. Ninth Army under Simpson worked directly under Montgomery. And it was no accident that Bradley and Ike stuck Simpson with Monty, because they knew that he would have a very favorable working relationship with the British, and he sure did. A very smart decision not to put Hodges or Patton in that role, because it would have ruffled feathers. Let's put it that way. And it worked all the way down to the 29th Division. You don't realize that Monty was really the Army Group commander for the 29th Division for much of World War II.
Right.
And interestingly enough, and I say this a lot in my books, the unfavorable impression of Monty that's overwhelming in American military history of the ETO was not really reflected in the 29th Division. There were tons of field grade officers in the division who really, really liked Monty. They had personal interaction with him. He often came to the division to decorate people. He got to know Gerhardt. He wrote a letter to Gerhardt at the end of the war. What a privilege it was to have your division under my command. So, this was part of Ike's genius, that he put the people who he knew would be the cooperative players in the role with Monty, which could have, under normal circumstances, been disastrous, but in 29th, it worked out like a charm.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting today with Joe Balkoski, who is the author of The Last Roll Call, the 29th Infantry Division, Victorious, 1945. We didn't get a chance to put your book cover up at the top of the show, Joe, but we put it up there. One of the things that struck me reading this book was the sadness that envelops every death, especially as we get closer to the end of the war. And it's sadness from the fellow soldiers, and it's sadness and mourning from you as a writer. And also, at the same time, as we're getting close to the end of the war, the loss of the D-Day veterans. I mean, there's so few of them left, and it seems to get to the point that every loss that this division is facing seems far more painful than it did 6 months earlier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, one of the challenges I faced in this series, of course, is that, I was lucky when I started it, because I got to know the living veterans very intimately. Many of them I considered my best buddies. And now there's really only one left, the fellow I mentioned who lives 2 miles from my house and now 105. But of course, the supreme challenge was getting to know the thousands of men who were killed in action, because I had to get to know them as much as I tried to get to know those who were lucky enough to survive. And that challenge was met often by meeting their family members. At the end of my book, The Last Roll Call, I talk about the return of a body. We'll get to that hopefully later in the show, but I befriended siblings of the deceased soldiers, and it was children, nieces, nephews, and it was so rewarding to get to understand who these people were. But as you cogently point out, Rick, as we enter April of 1945 and then May, the common attitude of any Allied soldier pushing toward the Elbe and on to Berlin was, I don't want to be the last man to die in the war. And that is kind of reflected in the prose of my book, because, you know, when a person is killed in these fanatical last-ditch stands of Germans in central Germany, you know, it really was a tragedy. And when I tried to get that over to the readers and describe who that person was, how he came to this place, how beloved he was in his unit. I tell a story in there about a very beloved soldier in the 115th Infantry, went all the way back to the National Guard days in Frederick, Maryland. His name was Lieutenant Cassell, and he'd married an English woman named Dorothy. Dorothy was one of the first war brides to go back to the States, and she resided in Frederick, Maryland when she came back. But damn it, her husband was killed in the last 2 weeks of World War II. And that shook every single person in the 115th Infantry, because everybody knew him. And I try to get that over in the book. And, as you point out, as we've come a long way, and we've on History Happy Hour, and a lot of the stories are tragic, but and as I given the subtitle for this book, the 29th Division Victorious, there's something good coming out of this at the end. And I tried to get that over, that attitude over, that, we're gonna be going home soon, and we did everything we were asked to do, and we treasure the memory of those men who made it possible. And that really is the theme of this last book.
So, Joe, we've had several questions from a man named Mark Cool, and I just want to preface this by saying that Mark's had a father who was in the 17th Airborne, and we just recently had a chance to take him back to where his dad was. So, he's been interested in the war in Europe, and kind of how units function and sustain themselves. And he wanted to know, we've been talking a lot about losses. Are the American people aware of the attrition rates that the 29th and other units are going through? And also he wanted to know, are the Germans aware of this? Do they see that as a weakness? Or, how much do people know about these losses?
Well, two parts to that question. No, the home front, particularly the east coast of the U.S., which was really where 90% of the original National Guardsmen and the draftees were drawn from. East and Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. No, the answer is that they did not understand that. It only was after World War II, when divisions made final casualty counts and they were made public. And I'm saying that probably happened in summer of 1945. And those stories were reported back home by the Baltimore Sun, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and it was a profound shock. That this division that we had known here in Maryland and Virginia since, 1917, and the very familiar division patch that it dated to World War I, and then the mobilization for World War II, and the training in Maryland and Virginia. Profound shock. The losses were so much higher than the people on the home front had been led to believe. Again, bears repeating, 28,000 casualties, including non-battle casualties in 11 months of combat for a 14,000 man division. So that's pretty unbelievable. Now, as far as the second part of your question, yes, the Germans did realize that these American divisions, and believe me, they knew about the 29th Division, because they were very good about understanding from prisoners of war who they were fighting against. Their impression of this was, we keep battering these divisions, but they're always in the line. Yeah. How do they do that? And, it was part of that whatever you may call the cruel American replacement system, which was modified in many positive ways as the war went on, but it was the essence of the American war effort, that we are going to keep these divisions in the line as long as it takes by pumping them with fresh men every time they lose men. And we're going to keep the pressure on the enemy every day. And the Germans, I think, were flummoxed by that because they didn't operate that way. And they would, maybe had they known, they might have operated that way, but they really couldn't because their whole military system was not based on that.
So in March 1945, the 29th takes the hometown of Joseph Goebbels. What's the name of the town? How do you say it?
Great.
Readied.
Reyddt.
And there's a great photo that you sent us of what happens. How does the 29th celebrate this moment in Goebbels' hometown?
Well, number one, they immediately started to use the Goebbels Castle as the 115th Infantry Command Post. And one of the very first things they do, there was one Jewish chaplain and one Jewish chaplain only in the 29th Division, and his name was Mendel Polyakov. I was very privileged to have known him, no longer living, lived very nearby me in Baltimore. And he said, let's hold a Jewish service on the Sabbath day, which is a Saturday, in Goebbels Castle. And he did. And here is the picture that Rick will show you.
I'm trying to bring it up, but it's resisting me. Okay. I'm not sure what's happening here. Hang on.
There you go. Oh.
Can you guys see it? Because I can't see it.
Well, it comes up briefly. Now, just don't touch anything, and it's there right now.
Wow, I don't see it at all.
This photo was, as Polyakov told me, he said he took real pride in this. He said so much pride that after the service he went outside and he knew this was the heart of Nazism. He and the three men in the photo, all of whom I knew, went out and urinated in the moat surrounding the castle. But that's Rabbi Polyakov in the center. On the left is Ben Mermelstein of Company H of the 115th Infantry, who I traveled to Normandy with several times. He was a wonderful man. He's holding the Torah. And on the right is another Baltimorean named Martin Willen, who was trained in the very famous Peabody School of Music in Baltimore, which is not one of the #1 schools of music in the country. And he had an operatic voice that could have made it into the Metropolitan Opera. And he was the cantor for this service. And this picture appeared in all of the papers of the United States. And I think this is the type of picture, that made the home front realize that the end was near. And, Goebbels actually saw the picture and he said he was ashamed and, but of course he wouldn't go, he wouldn't go down until the last couple of days when he took poison, as you know. So, anyway, that was, Polyakov told me that he was very uncomfortable having the swastika in the photo though.
So, Joe, one of the things that we've talked a lot about through this whole series is just how the American Army adapts and it learns and it changes and it evolves. And you had a quote in the book, and it's speaking about Operation Grenade, but we can kind of maybe apply it a little bit more broadly if you want. But it says, the operation, had been done, in fact, with a consummate skill and power that would have been unachievable in the U.S. Army in the not too distant past. So can you elaborate on that? Like how the change that had gone on and how fast it had happened
Well, I think you have to go to the genius behind the entire American war effort in World War II. I bring him up in all our happy hour talk. Yeah. I think you probably have to have him brought up in every one of your books. General George Marshall. He was a very distinguished veteran of World War I. He loved the American soldier and understood the American soldier better than almost anybody. Um, some people called him a genius, although he would have been the last person to ever say that, of course. He was very, very modest and he did not seek attention. But from the very beginning, he understood that the German military tradition of discipline and obedience was such that the American army, composed almost entirely of citizen soldiers, was going to have a hard time really establishing tactical superiority over this mighty enemy military machine. And he openly said in the beginning, after Kasserine Pass in February of 43, he said, don't despair. It's going to take divisions 2 years of solid training and a couple of months of solid experience against the enemy to become better than them. And that is what happens to a division like the 29th, which is in from day one in the Northwest Europe campaign. Normandy was very difficult for the 29th Division, despite 3 years of solid training and very difficult terrain. They lost 7,200 men in just 6 weeks. But, the cumulative lesson of how the Germans fight, the cumulative lesson of the best way we should fight, which, to put it in the simplest terms, is Sherman's doctrine, which is you pound the enemy mercilessly. And the 29th Division learned those lessons very well. And in the Roer River crossing on February 23rd of 45, everything was put together. Number one, if you look at the Roer River today, it looks like you can just walk across it and hardly get wet. But on 23rd of February, it was flooded. The Germans had blown, and they didn't blow up the dams, but they blew up the discharge valves of 2 upriver dams on February 8th, about 2 weeks before the division crossed the river. And the Roer, it had turned into a torrent. So much so that the Germans absolutely did not think that it was conceivable that any modern army could cross the river. It wasn't so much the width of the river, it was the speed of the river. Bridging, almost impossible. So the American army was getting good at everything it did. It wasn't just the 29th Division in this team that made the crossing. It was tons of sophisticated equipment. It was thousands of supporting engineers. It was hundreds and hundreds of supporting howitzers and cannon, and the genius of William Simpson, the commander of the Ninth Army, who made the very fateful decision to make the crossing when the flood was still raging, so that the Germans were surprised. So the combination of the brilliance of the high command, the efficiency of the supporting units, the power of the pre-assault bombardment, air power, and to top it off, the skill of the infantrymen, as you could see in the previous photo you put up, Rick, putting these pencil-thin bridges over the river and having men individually run across this flooded torrent under machine gun fire, and we saw how a man was killed on those bridges, and then do what they had to do. That's why I wrote that statement, Chris. And it was an engineer who was on the staff of the 29th Division or attached to the 29th Division, who said something like, if I had been asked to do this mission at Fort Belvoir, I think it was Fort Belvoir, which was the engineer school at that time, he said they would have kicked me out and said it was impossible. And there's no doubt the German army couldn't have done it. So
well, I think the other thing that impresses me too is that final campaign is not only that they can adapt this crossing, but they're so quick to absorb lessons learned and adapt. You talk about the night fighting, you talk about leapfrog tactics, all these things they're kind of getting their head around that problem pretty quickly.
Yes.
And that also speaks to, I think their professionalism.
Yeah, everything was put together. As I've mentioned in the previous talks with you guys, tactical air power in the American Army was pretty inefficient up until the late fall of 1944. But by early 1945, the use of tactical air power, thunderbolts and lightnings, and really coming down to help the frontline infantrymen was refined and very, very useful. And all of these lessons point to, yet again, how right George Marshall was, how it takes a long time to get good, but once we were good, the German military machine was actually, in comparison, was puny.
Yeah.
Now, that was not to say that, their soldiers, no 29th Division soldier would ever say a German did not fight ferociously. Up until their dying day, they had a respect for the German fighting man that was very, very intense. They never gave up.
One of the things a lot's happening with this division as they're approaching the Elbe River, and they get to the Elbe, and then it's not even say I'm not even sure I've ever talked about the Elbe River out loud.
Perfect.
Elbe, not the Elbe, the Elbe. I'm just trying to make Chris laugh there. They run across some V1 factories, but then they reach the Elbe and they get quite a surprise, Joe, and maybe you can tell us about it, from a German delegation that shows up and basically says, "Hey, we've got about 10,000 people who've been working on V2s, and we'd like to cross the Elbe and surrender to you." And that really surprised me. I mean, I did not realize the 29th's connection with that. And I can't hear Joe.
Well, that's May 2nd.
I struck you dumb there. Yeah.
You did. May 2nd, 1945, short of D-Day, is probably the most amazing day in the close on 5-year history of the 29th Division in the war years. As you said, Rick, they had reached the Elbe a couple of days before, but for strict orders from Ike, they were not to cross the Elbe because, the decision made by the High Command was the Elbe was to be the boundary between the Allied forces advancing from the west and the Red Army advancing from the east. That angered a lot of people, but that'll be our next History Happy Hour talk.
Okay.
So on May 2nd, 3 German officers appeared on the other side of the Elbe River waving a white flag, and they came on over into American lines, and immediately the story told to the young lieutenant there was way above his command level, and he sent him up to the regimental commander. And the story, as you hinted at, Rick, was that there was a division called, in the German army, it was called Division ZV, which stood for Zur Vergeltung, which meant retaliation division. That division had operated for a lot of the last year in Holland, 10,000 men, and their specialty was operating and maintaining V2 rockets, which were one of the German wonder weapons, which really might have impacted the war had they used them earlier and more efficiently, because there was really no answer to them other than destroying the sites where they were launched. But when it became clear that the Allies were going to overrun their launching sites, Hitler ordered the division to move east with all possible speed. And believe it or not, these 10,000 men who were from all branches of the German service, Air Force, Army, SS, they were told that they were going to go into the Battle of Berlin and fight as infantrymen. And needless to say, they were thrown into the Battle of Berlin, and the commander of the division, a man by the name of von Gaudecker, didn't like that very much, because he saw the writing on the wall. And not only was the writing on the wall, but his division was going to fall into the hands of the Russians. So he secretly sent these 3 officers to the Elbe, and lo and behold, they fall into the hands of the 29th Division. And these 3 men say, we have a secret plan. We're going to pull this division right off the bat out of the line at Berlin, and we're going to march them 60, 80 miles to the Elbe. We're going to cross here, and we want to be taken prisoner by you. And now General Gerhardt said, why not? And you know, now the real shocker of this plan is the Germans were much more afraid of what was going to happen to them when they pulled out of the line and headed west to the Elbe. They were more afraid of the reaction of their own people than the Americans. They were all set to fight their way through their own men, but there were a lot of questions asked about where all these men were going. And it turned out that they got to the Elbe safely, and in one of the most amazing events in division history, 10,000 men, Germans, were ferried across the Elbe and were taken prisoner. Now, these were not ordinary prisoners. You know, these were men who were familiar and expert in the use of V-2 rockets. And needless to say, the Allied High Command was very interested in these people, and they were quickly removed from the 29th Division and went to secret locations where we don't know really. We can assume.
Yeah, I think it means something.
But we do know that the Allied Western Allies were soon having V-2 practice launches over the North Sea to learn how they work. And also, interestingly enough, one of those 3 men who came over the Elbe was an SS officer. Interestingly enough, he was part of this conspiracy. And as much as the Americans trusted this guy, it turned out that he was later tried as a war criminal and was implicated in some very nasty stuff that had happened at a labor camp in central Germany. I think he avoided a jail sentence.
I'm shocked to hear that, Joe. Just shocked.
Anyway, and on the same day, I want you to know, May 2nd, same day, later in the day, a little further, only a mile or 2 to the south, the Americans made their first contact with the Red Army, and that was something. Here were the Americans. They weren't really supposed to cross the Elbe, but they went over in rowboats, and here were some Russians riding horses. It was a cavalry division that was rushing toward the Elbe from the east. And, all of those familiar scenes, the Americans putting on the Russian helmets and the Russians getting American cigarettes and chewing gum. They didn't understand the chewing gum. They put the gum in their mouths with the wrapper on it. And they said, I don't understand how this works. But, and then there was a high command, meeting the next day. The Americans gave the Russians a Thompson submachine gun and a Colt pistol, and they gave us a Cossack saber and a Russian submachine gun, which I am proud to say is in the museum that I used to run in Baltimore, and I really, that's the pieces of history that you really love. So May 2nd, 1945, very notable date in the division history.
So, Joe, given everything that they've gone through from Normandy on, they cross the Ruhr, they get into Germany, they're in Germany. What was their reaction to now kind of being in the belly of the beast? Were they, how were their relations with the Germans? What did they think when they finally got there?
Well, that question will also include the period of the occupation, because that's when they really got to know the Germans. Yeah. Now, one thing that most Americans don't understand is that there was a strict policy from the Allied High Command of non-fraternization. And that, to the American GI, that meant, damn it, I can't talk to German girls.
All right.
But, it was much more serious than that. I mean, you were not supposed to talk to any German. You know, the only thing we were looking out for was getting the people responsible for this mess, you know, thrown in the slammer, which was a major effort during the occupation. But you know, um, it was a very controversial policy for obvious reasons. You know, the American Army specified that I think it was a $25 fine, which was a substantial amount of money to it, like an enlisted man, for cohabitation with a German woman. And you know, of all the veterans I talked to, you know, they said it didn't really get to us because we were so exhausted and so drained emotionally from the effort that we put in that we didn't really want to do
Yeah.
much. You know, that policy would change during the occupation, and you know, the 29th Division remained in Bremen until January of 1946, and that period was interesting because very slowly we went from the initial contacts, very hostile, you know, meetings in the streets of Bremen that were nasty, you know, young German teenagers who'd just been released from the army being a little arrogant to American soldiers, incidents in the streets, um, you know, but as the months wore on to late 45, things would begin to, you know, get a little better. However, I will point out that I know of not a single marriage that ever happened between a 29th Division soldier and a German woman. Whereas, of course, they were so plentiful in Britain, and even a couple in France. But you know, the something lingered in their attitudes. You know, the division had been exposed to some of the horrors. They're named by the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The division 29th is as a liberator division because they liberated a work camp called Dinslaken. So they saw the worst of it, and you know, they were they had a hard time dealing initially following VE Day with dealing with German civilians.
Yeah.
So, but by January 46th, they were on their way home.
Well, you know, we're just going to go a little bit long because I've just, you know, we'll finish this up by asking you one last question, which is you talk about at the end of the book, you know, the 29th lost more than 3,000 killed, and after the war, American families had a one-time chance to bring the bodies of their loved ones home, and more than 50% did so. So when we visit the cemeteries in Normandy and elsewhere in Europe, this is less than 50% of the bodies that would have been there otherwise. And in telling that story, which is what you wrap up the book with, you focus on one soldier, Morris McGrath. So as we end the show, can you tell us his story?
Yeah, Morris McGrath. I came to know his family very well because his sister, Catherine, his younger sister, used to attend 29th Division reunions. Now, he died on October 7th in combat in Western Germany, in Bayswaler, Germany, and was buried in the Henri Chapelle U.S. military cemetery in Belgium. But Catherine, his sister, used to attend reunions just to try to meet her brother Morris's buddies. And she knew very little about his service, but you know, I looked up his service. He was a highly decorated hero on D-Day. He was named specifically by S.L.A. Marshall, the famous U.S. Army historian of the wartime period, as one of the remarkable Omaha Beach heroic figures. He later went on to command a company in the 116th Infantry. He was highly intelligent man. He was from Philadelphia and had a very lovely English girlfriend. They did not get married. And a very lovely family in Philadelphia who I came to know. Anyway, as you said, Rick, the U.S. War Department gave every family who lost a soldier or sailor or Marine in World War II the choice of what to do with the loved one's body, and they got a form called Disposition of Remains. It was just a 1 or 2 page form in which you had 3 choices. Have the body remain in a permanent American cemetery overseas, have the body brought home to the United States for burial in a national cemetery, or the more popular choice, have the body brought home for burial in the United States in a private cemetery. And most people in America today don't realize this, but number one, this program was unprecedented. Usually in the past, the European powers, whatever, when they fought an overseas war, they typically buried their dead overseas and usually did not make a major effort to bring them home. And this effort was going to be monumental to bring hundreds of thousands of, well, over 100,000 men home from temporary cemeteries overseas. And most people in America have no recognition of how long and how hard this effort was. No American dead, with a couple of exceptions, were brought home to America until late 1947. And by then, America had gotten back into its peacetime routine, and even though it was only 2 or 3 years in the past, wartime memories were distant. But in I should start in July of 1947, the first dead in Europe were disinterred from the Henri Chapelle cemetery in Belgium. It amounted to over 6,000 men. I think the number was 6,300 men that were floated down the Meuse River on barges to Antwerp, and they were put on the U.S. Army transport Joseph B. Connolly. And this was going to be the first transport of American dead from Europe back to America. It is such a moving story. And that is why I decided to end the book with that story. It was more fitting to me to reflect the sacrifice of the 3,500 29ers who died by ending the story, the 5 volumes, by saluting them. And when the Joseph Connolly left Antwerp, supposedly thousands of Belgians lined the wharves solemnly to see the ship depart. The ship arrived, and this, as a native New Yorker, this deeply moved me. October 27th, 1947, the Joseph B. Connolly arrived in New York Harbor. It was a Sunday, so people could come out to see what was going to happen. The Connolly docked on one of the Hudson River docks in Lower Manhattan, and even though there were 6,300 caskets on board, they took one, and one only, draped it in an American flag. And they say they don't know who, they did not identify in any account who that man was. It could have been a 29er. The legend is that it was somebody who held the Medal of Honor, but we don't know who it was. They took that casket off and put it on a carriage, and it was towed by an M8 armored car, Greyhound armored car, along 23rd Street in Manhattan, and then turned left or north on 5th Avenue. And the accounts of that day in New York are just stunning. The entire route, which is probably 3 miles, was lined shoulder to shoulder with people, and every block was total silence. Complete and total silence as the coffin draped in the Stars and Stripes went by. All of the notable New York landmarks, the the public library on 42nd Street, Rockefeller Center, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Sherman statue at Central Park. The body was brought into Central Park in the famous sheep meadow in which I used to play baseball as a kid. Beautiful part of Central Park. 150,000 people attended the ceremony in the sheep meadow with one coffin on a 10-foot high platform. And they gave absolute precedence to war widows to be in the front of the audience. And the ceremony that took place there, again, just stunning. West Point cadets fired a 21-gun salute, these were among the last words I wrote in my book. Morris McGrath ended up being taken. When the ceremony ended, the casket was brought back to the ship. The Connolly went over to Brooklyn the next day, and from there, the 6,300 caskets were put on train cars and went all over the United States to return home. Morris McGrath, his casket you always accompanied the casket with a soldier of equal rank. So a captain accompanied the McGrath casket to Philadelphia. The casket was brought into the McGrath home for a wake. I guess this by now it was early November 47 at this time. And Catherine told me, his sister, gave me all of the details. They had a service in the Catholic church down the street. And then the funeral they crossed the Schuylkill River to Westminster Cemetery, where Morris was laid to rest in a family plot. And that is where he is now. And, that story, particularly the event in Central Park, is so little known. And, it was the last words I would write in this 5-volume series. And, it was tough for me to write them because, you might have thought I'd be glad to get this task done, complete. As one of my favorite writers, Shelby Foote, noted at the end of his 3-volume Civil War trilogy that when he typed his last words in, it said it felt like he had swallowed a cannonball. and I vividly remember typing in my last words, which was the burial of Morris McGrath, and remembering that I knew his family, and I'm still in touch with his family. And I was completely drained, and I have to admit, tearful when I typed those last words in. And then I looked at my keyboard and I said, it's done. And, haven't written anything since. So that is the story of how the book ends. I thought the last line of the book is actually a quote from a British poem. And it is often seen you guys probably know this because you go into Commonwealth cemeteries. Sometimes it's written on the gravestones of British soldiers. And I ended the book with, "At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." And that is how the book ended. So my friends, we've come a long way. Yeah.
Well, Joe, I mean, you've been a real big part of the show, and I want to thank you for being on it for 6 times. Hope we can find a reason to get you back. But I also want to thank you for all the work you've done on the 29th. And
yeah, it's an amazing history that I think makes sure that they will be remembered the way that they should be remembered. And, so excellent. So well done.
Well, thank you. If I do gather up enough brain power to write another book. I think I know what I'm going to do. Instead of being this massive effort as I completed earlier, I'm going to write about one day, and that is I'm going to write about New York City on October 27th, 1947. I have a title. It's going to be called The Day the Dead Came Home.
Hmm.
And I'm going to, being a New Yorker, I'm going to try to put New York in perspective in this interesting period after World War II, but before really the Cold War is swinging into all its evilness. And anyway, what New York was like on that day and how New Yorkers came together in total respect for what their soldiers had done in World War II. So,
Well,
the person to write it, Joe.
And Joe, if you write that book, I know a show that would love to have you on to chat about it.
I guess I'll have to write it then.
Yeah,
There you
yeah,
go.
exactly. And maybe we'll have you on before then as well. Thank you very much, Joe Balkoski,
Joe.
author of a 5-volume series about the 29th Division. And we've been talking today about the last book in that series, The Last Roll Call, the 29th Infantry Division, Victorious, 1945. Joe, thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining
Joe.
us all these times.
You're welcome. There will be another time.
Well,
Okay.
we'll find some
All
reason to
right.
get back.
We'll work on that. We'll
I-
talk about that after
I have
we're
my hat, so you know.
Yeah, well,
right.
now you need a coffee mug.
You've got the. You didn't wear the hat the whole time, but at least you do have it there.
There we
Okay.
go. See?
Fair enough.
See?
Okay. Joe Balkoski, sorry for going long, everybody, but Joe, thank you so much for
Thanks,
joining
Joe.
us today.
Bye bye.
Okay.
And Chris, we would just go on briefly further to say that next week we're going to be talking with historian Martin King, who is the lead author, because there are several authors, of the book The Eagles of Bastogne. And I've known Martin for about 10 years, and my very first question has to be about why Martin, who is Scottish to the core, ended up living in Belgium and writing about Americans. So I'm not sure, but
Some explaining is necessary.
yeah, I think we're gonna have to get some explaining at the beginning of that show, but that's next week on History Happy Hour. So, guys, please, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.